We're on. Well, welcome to everyone, to those who are here in the auditorium and as well as those who are live streaming, especially those of you who are visiting with us. And we have several visitors here this morning. We're grateful to have you here. We're studying in Numbers. Our study, we do, for those who are visiting, excuse me, I'm a little stopped up this morning. For those who are visiting, we do trimesters here. As you might guess, that's a little over 3 months at a time. And this trimester in the auditorium, we're studying Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And as of Wednesday night, we're a third of the way through. We finished up Leviticus Wednesday night, and I appreciate what Kevin and Carrie have done in working with the three of us working together in our study here. So we're going to begin Numbers today, but it's going to be a little while before we get to the text of Numbers. In fact, since we're studying Numbers, I'm going to start this morning in Genesis chapter 12. If you want to go in your Bibles, Genesis chapter 12. But there are several things I want to say before we get to Genesis chapter 12. So that's where we're going to begin in a little bit. And let's start this morning with the word of prayer. Holy Father in heaven, we are grateful that we can come to you in prayer and to recognize you as the Holy One. And may we strive to be holy as you are holy, as you have commanded us to do. We thank you, Heavenly Father, for your word, and help us to always see that as your word and not trivialize it, and to recognize that it's how we need to live our lives each day. We'd ask you to be with us in our study today and give us clear minds and receptive hearts, and not just to know it, but to carry out your word in our lives each and every day that you have given us to live here. We have several here of our number who are hurting from physical and other kinds of difficulties, and without enumerating them, we know you know who they are, and we'd ask your blessings on them. And again, we'd ask your blessings on our study today in Jesus' name. Amen. We're dealing with Numbers, the Hebrew word, and only Carrie Dalton has a guttural ability to speak in Hebrew like it should be. So in the Hebrew word for Numbers, when it's translated, they said the wilderness. And it seems to me that's really appropriate as far as Numbers is concerned. And again, this is the introductory class on Numbers, and we'll have 10 classes counting today. I'll do today and Wednesday, and then 2 more. And Carrie will do 2, and Kevin will do 4. So we'll have 10 classes on this in the next several class periods. And I'll talk about Numbers more specifically a little later on. Numbers obviously has to do with traveling. And I don't want to trivialize this, but as I have thought about the wandering of the children of Israel in the wilderness, we talk a lot, and I think rightly so, about the crossing of the Red Sea and the miraculous nature of that. Do you ever really think about what went on, the impact of the traveling from Sinai to the Promised Land? When you read that, when you read about that, what do you think about that trip? Okay. Bobby says it took them about 11 days. I've read, one writer said it should have taken 11 days. Another one said it should have taken 2 weeks. And of course, it took them 40 years. Now, why did it take them 40 years? Unbelief. It wasn't God's fault. What else? When you read about this traveling in Numbers, what else you think about? Okay, 40 years waiting for them to die. A pleasant thought this morning, Carrie. But it's true. Sometimes truth is not pleasant, right? What else you think about that? Never went hungry. The clothes didn't wear out. I'm going to come back to that one a little bit later. What else? Do you make any application of that? Before you answer that, one of the challenges, it seems to me, with regard to books like Leviticus and Numbers, since those are the two we are in or have just been in, is not reading those in the abstract, thinking about, well, what do I get out of this? How does this help me live my life every day? And I thought about this. I've been thinking about this a while, but I thought about it this morning. Sometimes your mornings just don't go just right. At the breakfast table, there was a glass of water spilled, and it went everywhere. And then I got in here and had 3 minutes to go and left my water in the car, and I had to go running out. One of the ushers thought I was quitting. What do you think about? What do you get? What on earth in the book of Numbers is beneficial to you, Jake and Kelly? Great to see you all. What's beneficial to you out of this? Well, why you read it?
God provided.
Okay, certainly God provided.
God was working the human race toward the coming Messiah.
Exactly.
That's just part of it.
Yeah. Gene's comment is God's working toward the coming. That's the reason we're going to start in Genesis in a minute.
From Moses. People that he had to take care of. I mean, that was a huge undertaking.
Yeah. The comment is felt sorry for Moses, all the people he had to care for. It's kind of like being a wife and a mother, only on a larger scale. Some nods on that one. Anything else? Well, have you ever thought about these people are traveling, and as has been pointed out here, they travel for 40 years. Have you ever thought about the likeness between this and your life? Have you ever thought about today you're traveling in the sight of God? I know we've got several visitors this morning, so not traveling in that sense, but, day by day. Pardon? Traveling in life. You ever think about that? Well, think about that, if you will, as we go through this, because one of the lessons I get out of this is, as somebody's already said, is how God provided for them. In many ways, and I've never heard this term used, and you may be offended by it, in many ways, all this to me is miraculous. Now, it's not miraculous like the parting of the Red Sea, but just think about this as we go through it. So, those are things that, to me, say something about the magnitude of what goes on here. It's a magnificent thing as far as numbers and a whole bunch of things, but most important to me out of all this is God takes care of these people. Now, he also dispenses his justice in that. And we live this out every day in our lives, every day. So to me, when I read this, it helps me in things I deal with. Now, don't misunderstand me. I don't deal with things of this nature, but it has to do with how I see God, and I think God is in my life like he was in their lives. Genesis chapter 12. Most of you, both here and probably in the live stream audience, are familiar with this. This is the promise that God makes through Abraham. Genesis 12:1. Now the Lord said to Abraham, "Get out of your country and from your family and from your father's house to a land that I will show you. I will make you a great nation. I'll bless you. I'll make your name great, and you will be a blessing. And I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse him who curses you. And in your families, in you, all the families of the earth shall be blessed." And that's obviously one of the more magnificent statements of these three promises. And then when you think about all the families being blessed, you see this played out first in the book of Acts. And in Acts chapter 3, Peter and John are preaching. Acts chapter 3, beginning in verse 25, they say to them, "You're the sons of the prophets and of the a covenant which God made with your father, saying to Abraham, and in your seed will all the families of the earth shall be blessed. To you first God, having raised up your servant Jesus, sent him to bless you in turning away from every one of you from your iniquities. So the promise that God makes in Genesis 12 that we just read, to me says this journey had to be taken. They had to get where? They had to get to Bethlehem. They had to get to the promised land for all this to be fulfilled. So those are some thoughts that I have about how we look at this journey and how it takes place. These people had been at Sinai for 11 or 12 months. They probably had camped out there. And again, I don't know what kind of image you have about this travel, but they're probably, it's not here one night and next stop another night and so forth. They probably spent periods of time, and we know they spent almost a year in Sinai. And it would have had to spend, even if it's 40 years, they have to spend a lot of time in several different places. So it's not just one continuous journey. And God was the guiding factor in all of this. So as you read the text this trimester from Numbers, and as we discuss, please think about yourself, and I think about myself as being on a journey like they are. Now again, I think it's analogous. What journey are you looking to? Where do you look to end in your journey? Well, it's not Alvaton. Where, Gail? I'd say heaven. I'd say the promised land, just like they were. And we deal with a lot of things. Many of the things we deal with, and I'm going to talk about this a little later and thinking about them, many of the things we deal with are not nearly as serious as we think they are. We in my opinion, and don't misunderstand me, there are some really serious things that go on in all our lives. There are serious things that go on physically, and there's serious things that go on spiritually with us. But we're not exactly analogous to what they're dealing with here. So as you read this, please think about the journey that you're on. Now think about the journey I'm on. And there's some comforting things to me out of this. Now again, and I've already used this word 3 times, I don't want to trivialize what I'm about to do here, but let's look at this journey a little bit, and we're going to finally get to the text in a minute. Let's look at this a little bit about this journey and think about we're in a point in our society in this country where, as I look around, there are people in here who've traveled far and wide. And when you make a trip, there are a lot of things you do. You get prepared, you plan how you're going to get there, and all these kinds of things. When we make trips or have made trips, we're probably old enough we're not going to make many like we have in the past. I'm really fortunate because Rose is a detail person. And I know when we get to wherever we're going, if there's something insignificant, it's going to be there unless she's forgotten it. No, it's going to be there. All I have to do is pack my things. I don't want anybody packing my wardrobe because I know what I want to wear. But she does all these other things. Well, when you think about taking a trip, you can think about all these things you do. And that's what goes on here. So let's look at this as a journey just a moment that they're on. First of all, God is the one who's in charge. And whether you know it or not, whether you accept it or not, he's in charge when you take a trip also. The destination is the promised land. Sometimes we want to get to our destination more quickly than it's possible. The mode of transportation, well, they walked, they rode maybe an animal, they rode on carts, they rode on wagons. But however it was, I read recently with someone who was secular writing about about this, and whether this is right or not, I don't know. But this writer was saying that probably how they traveled and lived was kind of like the tribal people you still see in that part of the world today called the Bedouins. And the Bedouins, even today, will live in tents for a while, and they take care of their flocks and this sort of thing. And when the green grass is eaten, they go somewhere else. And he said that's kind of how these people probably were all these many years ago. Their needs, they had needs both individually and collectively. And Marty's already mentioned about their wardrobe. And it's Sunday morning. And either Saturday night or Sunday morning, what did you think about wardrobe-wise? What am I going to wear? I wore this last Sunday. And it's too long, it's too short, it's not in the right season. My tie's too wide. My tie's a little wide this morning. And it really offends me. God took care of that. Their shoes lasted 40 years. That in itself, and not to make light of this, but we're talking about God's hand in all this. And God can be with us in our travel. And He doesn't care, I hate to tell you all this, He doesn't care where you got your shoes and how long you wear them. The same thing was true with their clothes. If you were going to travel for 40 years, think how many clothes you would take. And then the other need they had was food and water. Who provided it? Kroger's didn't. Aldi's didn't. God did. And that becomes an issue and a factor in all this. Then I guess the one that strikes me most, think about the size of the group. When they took the census of everybody but the Levites, it was how many? 603,000. Now, this is the way, and I'm not going to, there are two things about this I want to say quickly. One is critics of the scripture will pick on the number. In fact, they pick on it from two standpoints, or maybe more than that, but two I'm aware of. One is that, well, how could, at the time of Jacob, how could 70 people go into Egypt and come out with 603,000 people? Well, I don't know the answer to that other than I believe God took care of that, and He said that's how many they were, and I'm willing to go with that. The other thing, people then take the 603, these are males over age 20, as you know, presumably fighting men, which I'll talk about again in a minute. Then they had obviously women and children with them, maybe some other non-Hebrew people who joined the group along the way. And as a result, you'll read where people will say, well, the total was 1.8 million, the total was 2 million, the total was 2.5 million. Well, all I know is it's 603,000, which is a big group. And if you think about that, just think about seeing that many people wandering through this wilderness. And just think of all the logistical problems that go with that. And that's what, to me, makes this such, among other things, makes this such an amazing thing. And as I said earlier, to me, it's almost a miraculous kind of thing. So it's the size of the group, the nature of the route that they were taking. I'm guarantee you, I'm sure on this, they did not Google it. I'm just confident of that. And they took a pretty circuitous kind of route as they went through there, whichever route you think they took. Then I guess the other thing I would mention is kind of the attitude of the travel. If you have traveled with small children very much in the car, you're not gone very far before they say, what? Are we there yet? I remember many years ago when Sterling and Cole were small and we were going to Florida. And we were down somewhere in Tennessee, and they were talking about getting to the ocean, and they said, are we there yet? Well, we crossed a river. And I said, look at that water. I said, that's the ocean. Well, they pretty soon realized. It's kind of like, I'm getting way afield here, but it's kind of like when Sterling was, I think, 5 years old, and he had a friend with him, and I said something sort of like that. And he said, don't believe him. He said, he'll tell you anything. So they picked up on that pretty quickly. But, you know, Well, what was the attitude of these God's people? What was the attitude of God's people as they traveled? What, murmuring? They complained about what? Food, water, Moses, and even Aaron and his sister at one time were complaining about Moses. So on this trip, all of these things are going sort of south, as we say. It's because of that and their lack of faith in God that caused God to let them wander as long as they did.
That's just like with us. They made bad choices. We made bad choices. And we had to
We,
directions to get back on the right path.
so we have to wander a while before we get back on the right path, hopefully. So, and then the other thing I would just mention, if you have traveled any in this part of the world, or if you've read about it, or you've seen things about it, this is not the most hospitable place to travel. You know, it's hot, it's dry, it's also cold there at certain times of the year. And remember, they're there 40 years, so they get all of the seasons. There's part of it, there's not much vegetation. I mean, there are just all kinds of things that says this is not where I'm going to take my vacation. So all of that says to me, this is a major kind of thing that we can learn from, and we can apply this to our lives every day. And when we have these quote problems, and I'm not making light of the things we deal with in life that are difficult, because I look around this auditorium, there are people sitting here now who have health issues and other things that we just have to deal with. The comforting thing I think out of this is, just like with these people, God can be with us. And who determines that? We do. God has offered that to us. Okay. Anything else? Yes, probably all you want to talk about as far as background about this. Anything you want to say? Anything else about this wandering?
All these are not the same.
Start again.
These are not the same Israelites that went into Egypt. This
Yeah.
generation, you know, 2 or 3 generations past, and you don't know how much they were taught about God. So that's one other thing that there's there too.
Yeah, Linda's point is that these are obviously not the Hebrews who went into Egypt, and it would appear from things that go on after they leave that there had been some voids in their teaching. Charlene?
I think the thing that's comforting is that God never departed with the pillar of fire and the cloud that went before them until they were ready to cross into the land of Canaan.
Yeah.
He was there, and I believe he's there in our lives in that unseen way today.
Yeah, and as I should have mentioned that earlier. Thank you. That's her point is, as we all know, that God guided them through the pillar of fire by night and the cloud by day, and God guides us. The pillar and the cloud we have are the Word of God, and God guides us as He guided them. I don't know about you all, but sometimes I'm pretty typical of these people on this journey. I hate to admit that, but I need to admit that. And I'm probably the only one in the audience where that's the case. But anyway, that's the way it is. What's that?
I was whispering to Rose.
I know it.
What did you just say?
I said I'm like these people on this journey sometimes.
Joshua and Caleb never grew old either.
Yeah. Joshua and Caleb didn't grow old, but they did die.
But during that 40 years, they didn't age like
Yeah. Right. That's because He needed them. Yeah.
they believed.
They were believers, yes. They were believers and they acted on what they believed. Sometimes that's also a factor. Gene?
I hate to continue,
That's all right.
but I always look at these things looking for the future.
Yeah.
And we see Abraham, we see Moses, here's people that believe that God was not a thing, but a spirit.
Yeah.
And God's a rarity in
Joshua, and yeah.
and the prophets and all these. And it should be in our heads that he's still trying to teach
Yeah.
about the Spirit. And we need to be careful about that.
Wait. I can't summarize all that. But Gene's point is that, God is a spirit, and he's trying to get us to understand that and to inculcate that in our lives. Yes. Okay. All right. Okay. Let's do one other thing before we go to some verses. Let me just kind of, as I would call it, do a quick journey through Numbers. In other words, what we're going to be dealing with in the next 9 class periods. And it's interesting to me that this book is about the journey. There are 36 chapters in this book, and the first 10 are getting ready for the trip. And they don't really depart until chapter 10 and verse 11, I think it is. So the first part, what I'm going to deal with today and Wednesday night, is all the preparation for the trip. And I won't do what I did today again. So they're getting prepared, and this is in chapters 1 through 9, and then the first 10 verses of chapter 10. He deals there with the responsibilities of the priests and the responsibilities of Aaron and Moses. And then he gives them some additional laws in the first part of the book, as well as some other parts of the book. And then beginning in chapter 10 and verse 10, and this is where Kevin picks up, I just have in my notes that they're off. Whoop, that they're off. They finally started. That didn't sound like they were off. That they finally got started, and they're not very far into the journey till complaints start. Which again, not to beat this dead horse to death, is kind of like we do. We start our journey as a Christian, and pretty soon something comes along that doesn't suit us, and we start harping about it. We have the selection of the 70 elders, and then we have the first food provided by God, and that's the quail. And then that's in chapter 10 through chapter 12, in chapters 13 through 17, and Kevin and Carrie are going to kind of split these. That's where we have Aaron and Miriam speaking against Moses, and they send the spies out. And this one is really interesting to me. It's in this section where the people refuse to go into the promised land. And here, this has been something they've been looking forward to all these centuries. And then they get there and at first refuse to go into the promised land. And I'll be interested to see what our teachers have to say about that. And then the people just rebel. And then his chapters 20 through 24, Carrie will be teaching. We have there Moses, God instructed him about the rock for water, and he gets off base on that. They begin their encounters with the inhabitants, and one of those that really is an issue for them is Balaam. You remember Balak had contracted with Balaam to try to undo the Israelites, and Balaam is there. And then in chapters 25 through 32, Kevin will do that one. That's on Moab. And that's where these Israelites pick up harlotry. They begin to be adulterous, or idolatry, excuse me. Well, that's a form of adultery. Idolatrous kinds of people. And then they take another census, and Joshua emerges slightly. And it's apparent that Joshua is the leader in waiting. And then they have some offerings there. And finally, they get to the east side of Jordan. And that's in chapter 32. And then the last three chapters, 33 through 36. I hate to tell you, I'm going to be doing those. I'm doing the introduction and the conclusion this time. But you'll have 7 class periods where I won't be here. So that's the good news. And in those, in chapter 33, you kind of have a recap of the journey. And then the conquest of Canaan and instructions about how they're to do that. And then they have the division of the lands by the various tribes. Additional rules are given to them, particularly on marriage for females and the heirs when they inherit land. And then they just come to a conclusion and get ready to start into Deuteronomy. And I would say, in thinking about this survey of Numbers, that it started out according to God's plan, great problems developed, and it ends with the grace of God. And if you would, think about your life when you think about all that. Okay, Numbers chapter 1, if you want to go there. We've got a few minutes to do first 3 or 4 chapters of Numbers. And as far as Wednesday night's concerned, wherever we leave off this morning, we're going to pick up there on Wednesday night and go through 10:10. And some of these chapters I'm going to talk a whole lot about. Chapter 1, verse 1, now the Lord spoke to Moses in the wilderness of Sinai and in the tabernacle of meeting on the first day of the 2nd month in the 2nd year after they had come out of the land of Egypt, saying, take a census of all the congregation of the children of Israel by their families and by their fathers' houses, according to the number of names, every male individually, from 20 years old and above, all who are able to go to war in Israel. You and Aaron shall number them by their armies. And they do that, and that's when they come up with the 600 and 3,000, what have you. Let me ask a question. Do you find anything unusual, anything interesting about numbering these who are able to go to war? They're anticipating going to war. That's certainly valid. You find anything unusual with regard to God's, how God conducts, how He leads them in that regard? What happened with Gideon? They rely on numbers? Pardon? He had too many. Why? Why did he have too many? Exactly. Do you remember early on when they, I think it was a Hyksos, but whoever it was, they captured some horses. See, they didn't have horses at this time. And if you think about those people coming down from the north, they had what some writers have referred to as war chariots. I don't know whether they were the first tanks or whatever they were. I'll get this back on. Maybe I will. Point of making this point. But you remember that when they captured these horses, you remember what God had them do to them? They cut the hamstring, because God did not want them to depend on horses and chariots. He wanted to depend upon whom? Upon Him. So I have found it interesting here, and I'm not trying to second guess God, so don't misunderstand that. I found it interesting that it had them numbered of the fighting people, when God's not going to let them use all those people to fight anyway. But that's part of how He wanted this handed out, and it's all right with me. Anyway, they take this census, and okay. Gail's point is that these are the ones who are going to die because they're over 20. Well, that's true. I hadn't thought about it that way. Maybe that's a good point, Gail. I hadn't thought about that. So anyway, and if you look down then in verses 5 through 15, we have each one of the tribes and who's going to be the lead person, and they do this census through this process. Verses 16 and 17 regarding these leaders. These were chosen from the congregation, leaders of their fathers' tribes, heads of the divisions of Israel. Then Moses and Aaron took these men who had been mentioned by name, and they assembled all the congregation together on the first day of the 2nd month, and they recited their ancestry by families and by fathers and houses, and according to the number of names from 20 years old and above, each one individually. And again, that's something that to me, just think about. You've got all this crowd assembled together. And I'm not saying they all stayed in the same place, but the process they went through. And again, it's the enormity of the whole thing to me is really interesting. And I'll just say something quickly here. Genealogy is a significant kind of thing here for the Jewish people. Wonder why? Well, first of all, which particular tribe was the genealogy especially important? And it's the Levites, because of the priests, right? And the priesthood. And if you remember in Ezra and Nehemiah, when they come back from Babylonian captivity, one of the problems they had there in worship was they didn't, well, first of all, they had to identify who could participate in this service, depending on whether they were a Levite or not. And then secondly, since they had gotten so far away from God, they didn't have enough people, or they had a scarcity of people, I'll put it that way, to conduct their services. So they do this survey of all these people, and then beginning in verse 21 of chapter 1, you have each tribe and how many people in this age group they had. And all that together comes out to be 603,000 we've talked about. Now, Levi is not included in this. And why is Levi not included? They're not going to fight. They do what? They're the priests. That's the priestly tribe. So they're not going to be part of the fighting group. And I've said 600,000. It's actually in verse 46, 603,550. And then the Levites were excluded. In verse 51 of chapter 1, and when the tabernacle is to go forward, the Levites shall take it down, and when the tabernacle is to be set up, the Levites shall set it up, and the outsider who comes near shall be put to death. In other words, it's just the Levites who are involved in this. And we're going to talk more about their role in that later. And then in 54, he says, and this is an impactful statement to me, and thus the children of Israel did according to all that the Lord commanded Moses. So they did. So to start with, they're with God. And if you remember back, and I've already cited this 2 or 3 times in this class, if you go back to Exodus chapter 19, and they're at Sinai, and God's up here, and Moses is halfway up, and the people are down here, and Moses brings the word back to them. When God extends his covenant, 2 different occasions, the people say to Moses, yes, we will obey this. Yes, we will. And then we see that they fall away some. Not that that's like anybody else you've ever known. So that's chapter 1. Anything you want to comment or ask about chapter 1? Chapter 2, the census is finished. Verse 1 of chapter 2, and the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, every one of the children of Israel shall camp by his own standard beside the emblem of his father's house, and they shall camp some distance from the tabernacle of meeting. And chapter 2 to me is really interesting, and it's how when they camp, when the journey is over and they assemble, and what's in the very center of their assembly? The tabernacle. Now, what's at the tabernacle? The presence of God. So you would want that to be there. And then next to the tabernacle is which tribe, do you think? The Levites. And then when we get to chapter 4, I think it is, within the Levites, there are the 3, would be Aaron's grandchildren. Yeah. They also have, they have positions around that. And then if you read this, if you've read this chapter, and it gets a little bit challenging to read that because it's repeated over and over, except where each tribe would be located. And when they assemble, when they stop the journey, wherever it is, that's how they are to assemble and where they're to be. And not only that, they instruct them as to how they should, when they break camp and they get ready to start another day, how they should leave. The first to break camp is Judah. And then Reuben is second, and Benjamin third. And then it says Daniel, the or Dan rather. Dan is the last one to leave. Now, what to me is noteworthy about this is the level of organization in this whole thing. And just think, you got all these people, and you just can't blow the whistle and say go. Now, also, each one of them had, depending on your translation, it's called the standard. It's their flag, and they had on it, like Judah is going to have what? A what? Going to have the lion on there. So they have, their banner up, and that's sort of, where you, and this has been used. It's interesting, I think, to think about the impact that the Word of God has had in so many different ways, not just in spiritual. And I think maybe before this time, but certainly from this time forward, we've used these guide arms. And you have, in the military, you have this. Each company has their flag, and you assemble on that or you depart on that. And God provided all these arrangements for them. With Judah being first, any thoughts about that? Who's the oldest son? Reuben, right? And Reuben is second to lead the group. Judah is first. Do you remember in maybe it's chapter 49, one of the last chapters of Genesis, when Jacob is about ready to die, and he calls his sons in, and he says, he sort of gives them their parting words, some of which are not real comforting. You remember what he says about Reuben? Yeah, as weak as water. And then he says some other things about it. And some things happened with Reuben down through the years that would have caused him to say that. So you would think, given their culture, that the oldest would be the first. But the oldest is not the first because of some of the things that go on there. Anyway, point about all this is God provided order for this. It made all this possible. Anything on chapter 2 you want to say? Yeah. Carrie's pointed out that Judah will eventually become the king of the tribe. And of course, there's another thing. He has some ancestors, right? Some descendants. Some important ones. Yeah. Particularly when you get to New Testament times. We'll just leave it there. Let me see. 2 minutes. Chapter 3, they number the Levites. And more than that, talk about their duties in great detail. And not just in general, but by specific children. Look in chapter 3 and verse 1. Now these are the records of Aaron and Moses regarding the Lord spoke with Moses on Mount Sinai. And these are the names of the sons of Aaron. Nadab, we know about the firstborn, and Abihu, and we've talked about it a couple times here already. You remember what happened to them? They God took their lives because of their strange fire. Then the other siblings there are I'll get back here in a minute. Abihu and Eleazar and Ithmar. And these then are the siblings of Nadab and Abihu. Verse 2, these are the names of the sons of Aaron, the anointed priest, whom he consecrated to minister as priest. And then he points out in verse 4 that Nadab and Abihu had died. Then what we have then in chapter 3 is by kind of subdivision of the tribe of Levi, what they were to do and who was to do it. And we'll pick up with this on Wednesday night a little bit. And you'll see, for example, in beginning in verse 14, he talks about 3 of these, I guess are his grandchildren and what they were to do. And it all has to do with the tabernacle. And remember, the tabernacle is something that's a pattern for us. And thank you all for being here. And we'll pick up just a little bit in chapter 3 and go through 10:10 on Wednesday. And I appreciate your comments and your attention.